In the summer of 1940, German propagandists began broadcasting as fake English radio stations. They described grisly details of air raid deaths and injuries to their British audience. They gave advice meant to increase the terror. Their goal was to undermine the popular support of the strongest voice in England that advocated for continuing the war with Germany after the surrender of France, a man in pink silk underwear. Splendid and the Vile is a historical account of the first year of Winston Churchill's run as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, from the summer of 1940 to the summer of 1941. Neville Chamberlain was the Prime Minister as Germany began invading neighboring kingdoms and World War II began. His credibility faltered, not in principle by this event, but by the failure of England's attempt to counter the German invasion of Norway. On May 7th, a vote of confidence left Chamberlain in his position, yet it clearly showed how much support he had lost. He resigned. Churchill was asked to form a new government. The Splendid and the Vile charts the first year in power, as Churchill struggled to prepare his country for the certain eventuality of an invasion, and to maintain the commitment of the public to remain in the war against Germany in the face of nightly aerial bombardment. In that role, and his effect on history, you could consider Churchill as one of the earliest social media influencers. Churchill's medium was the radio. Home intelligence reports and Gallup polls provided a thumbs up or thumbs down effect depending on the opinions of his British audience. That audience even participated in an early form of blogging about their opinions of Churchill, recording their observations in British mood in diaries collected in a project called Mass Observation. And Churchill was even the subject of his era's own form of reaction radio messages, as Hitler replied from Germany, promising to end the bombardment if only Britain would agree to an armistice. To be clear, Erik Larson wrote The Splendid and the Vile as a historical account of how the British public reacted to the call of their government to remain in a war with Germany in the face of nightly aerial bombardment and the very real threat of an invasion. That bombardment was clearly intended for civilian targets, and individual bombs had the power to level entire city blocks on their own. While the odds of any one person dying each night were very small, every night the public understood that someone would die. And Larson creates a chronicle worth reading, even for those familiar with the persona of Churchill and his pink silk underwear, a subject revealed in a hit piece in a magazine at the time. I have been a fan of Larson since I read Isaac Storm, his nonfiction account of the Galveston hurricane of 1900, and I would say that another work of his, In the Garden of Beasts, which follows the last American ambassador to Germany before the outbreak of World War II, provides a more original insight into this era. Churchill is well studied as a public persona, and the truth that he conducted government business while in his bathtub and drank a lot of whiskey has been covered earlier by contemporary sources. Yet Larson does manage to create his own distinctive work by narrowing the focus of his new book to this one year and this one singular question: why did Britain remain at war with Germany in the face of nightly destruction of its cities, and what role did Churchill play in their steely resolve? To explore this year, Larson drew on an immense archive of diaries and letters, and newsreels and official reports. One of the prominent viewpoints that Larson follows is one of Churchill's private secretaries, who kept a very secret and very illegal private diary. An edited version of that diary is published under the title The Fringes of Power. Larson also includes the experiences of the public who recorded this year in the project called Mass Observation, where common people kept diaries about their personal lives and then gave them to researchers. Larson includes both reactions to Churchill's speeches and entries detailing the experience of the nightly bombing raids. On this note, I do wish that Larson had included the original instructions of the Mass Observation Project, as well as one or two whole incomplete entries, however short. The final source I would mention is that Larson was given access to the private diary of Mary Churchill, the Prime Minister's youngest daughter, and he is the first researcher allowed to publish from its contents. Mary's contribution details her reaction to her father's rise to power and the effects of public criticism on her family. But at the end of Larson's book, we learn that Mary went on to become an anti-aircraft gunner assigned to Hyde Park and a leader of 230 female volunteers. Part of me wishes that Larson's focus had been Mary's experience of the war, rather than her father, who so dominates our historical narrative of that war, and even this book. Perhaps that will be a story for another time. All this being said, I would suggest the value of seeing Churchill in this year as one of our earliest social media influencers. Churchill had a very structured style to his speeches. They were more than a duty of his office. They were the means of ensuring he retained enough popularity to remain in power in the face of civilian deaths and military disasters, of which there were many in the first year of the war. Churchill's speeches were a careful construction of a story, beginning first with his appraisal of events, even if this cast them in a negative light. He then followed with real and concrete reasons for optimism. And then he would end with a quick rhetorical flourish, one strong sentence that people could repeat to themselves for hours. This was their finest hour, and we shall never surrender. The consistency of his format increased his ability to control the message about the enemy that Britain faced and to ground their fears in a more mundane reality. He never called Hitler by his name. He was only that man. And the Nazis were often only those men. And his audience understood that men are never an unstoppable army, and that a man can be killed. Churchill also understood the value of using symbolic acts to increase his credibility. He frequently walked through bombed-out areas of London and traveled to other cities after they too were attacked. He walked through the streets and talked to the survivors, often showing people where he was in the crowds by balancing his hat in the air on top of his walking stick. He wept openly with the crowds, but he never showed fear. He let them know that their government was not ignoring what they were going through, and had not abandoned them for the safety of Canada, as German propagandists told them in broadcast after broadcast. And then Churchill went on the radio himself, and he told the rest of the British public about his experience, how the people in bombed-out areas were taking care of each other. However much it mystified foreign governments that Churchill exposed himself to the danger of unexploded ordnance and surprise air raids, the act of being seen by the highest civilian power had a profound influence on the willingness of the British public to continue the war effort, even when Churchill could see no path to victory if England remained fighting alone. And yet, whatever my interest in considering Churchill in this role, and what it might teach us about leadership, Churchill does fight to take up space in Larson's book. Many other people besides Churchill exist within the bounds of this 1 year, and Larson's account does capture secretaries and socialites, jazz singers and factory owners, and people with no real description at all. A lowly scientist in the Air Force learns how Germans can launch night attacks without needing the light of the moon. A woman makes her family laugh as air raid siren sounds by giving herself a mock funeral on the living room floor, complete with lilies clasped in her hands. And yet Larson, in the brevity of the chapters and the short glimpses into each life, resists creating a feel-good story that carries the reader through the bombardment safe and facing the cost. Luck alone meant they survived to give an account of their lives. Luck alone meant their diaries weren't incinerated along with their entire apartment building. For in the end, the total of civilian deaths stood at 44,652. Of them, 5,626 were children. Churchill used his influence to get people to pay costs to continue the fight against Germany and against the Nazi control of Europe, and that cost was real. The story of how they responded to his call, their own determination, would be too cheap and too unbelievable without including their ordinary lives inside the narrative. I believe Larson's success in this effort is that in order to tell the story of that 1 year, each of the living characters exist on the stage only for the time that the incendiary fires burn around them. Because the bombardment itself is a central character, as noted in one diary, the illumination of a city at night under 1,000 falling stars, and the horror brought by that light, a monster both splendid and vile.